This morning, two very different stories are unfolding at the same time. In parts of the United States, grain silos are full, prices feel squeezed, and farmers watch trade rules shift faster than seasons change. Agriculture, once the quiet backbone of American strength, now sits inside global tension shaped by tariffs, counter-tariffs, and uncertain markets. At the same moment, thousands of miles away in Burkina Faso, cotton moves through villages with a different meaning. Not as a cheap export, not as a raw material rushed out of the country, but as the beginning of something deliberately held closer to home. What connects these two scenes is not ideology and not anger, but pressure. When economic pressure rises, nations reveal who controls value and who merely supplies it. Burkina Faso, long seen as one of the world's poorest countries, is now being spoken about in a new way across Africa. Not because it discovered oil or struck gold, but because it asked a simple, unsettling question. Why should African labor always create wealth elsewhere? At the center of that question stands Ibrahim Traore, not as a loud revolutionary figure, but as a symbol of a different economic language, one that speaks about dignity, control, and terms written locally. Cotton, a crop tied to family income and daily work, has become the unlikely banner of this shift, with estimates pointing to a $3.8 billion value chain once processing and trade stay closer to home. This is not a story about America collapsing, and it is not a story about Africa suddenly winning. It is a story about imbalance meeting resistance, quietly, methodically, without slogans. And that is precisely why it matters. If this kind of change can happen without a single shot fired, then the global order may be shifting in ways few expected. If you want straight Africa news and calm analysis that looks beyond headlines, press like and subscribe now, because what begins with cotton in Burkina Faso could soon reshape how power is measured far beyond Africa. The real question is not whether this will work, but what happens if other nations decide to try the same path? What actually changed in Burkina Faso did not begin with a speech or a flag, but with a decision about where value should live. For decades, cotton left the country raw, lightly priced, and quickly forgotten, while finished textiles returned at many times the cost. That pattern was not unique to Burkina Faso. It was the default position assigned to much of Africa in the global economy. Under Ibrahim Traore, that quiet habit was interrupted. Instead of racing cotton to ports, the state began reshaping how the crop moved through the economy, prioritizing local processing, regional trade, and contracts that rewarded finishing work on African soil. Estimates about a $3.8 billion value chain are expected, particular shows in manism. Estimates around a $3.8 billion value chain are present as a promise carved in stone, but as a signal of scale, showing how much wealth had previously slipped away through raw export structures. In practical terms, this meant investment in ginning capacity, renewed attention to textile processing, and a recalibration of who negotiates prices and terms. It also meant friction, because every value chain kept at home is one less margin captured elsewhere. In the countryside, the change was felt less as policy and more as possibility. A cotton farmer outside Bobo Dioulasso described it simply: "For years, buyers dictated the price and timing, and his role ended at harvest. Now discussions reach beyond the field, into storage, processing, and local demand." His son, who once assumed migration was the only path forward, started asking different questions, not about leaving, but about learning skills that mattered nearby. This is where cotton becomes more than a commodity. It becomes a stabilizer, anchoring families and slowing the quiet drain of youth from rural communities. From the government's perspective, the logic is blunt. Countries that export raw materials remain exposed to price swings they do not control. Countries that process and trade finished goods, even at modest scale, gain leverage, time, and bargaining power. Traore's framing does not reject global trade. It reframes participation. Burkina Faso does not seek isolation. It seeks terms that do not reduce its labor to a discount. That distinction matters. In Washington and other capitals, such moves are often described cautiously, using words like risk and capacity constraints. Yet from an African viewpoint, the greater risk has always been dependence on markets that close without warning. Cotton, chosen precisely because it is ordinary, forces a harder question on the global system. If a country with limited capital and serious security challenges can begin retaining value from something as basic as cotton, what excuse remains for perpetual extraction elsewhere? The shift also fits into a broader African recalculation. Regional buyers reappear. Intra-African trade discussions gain urgency. The idea of processing at home stops sounding idealistic and starts sounding necessary. This is why the cotton story travels beyond Burkina Faso. It is repeated in markets, on buses, and in diaspora conversations, not as propaganda, but as a test case. People watch closely, not expecting miracles, but looking for proof that dignity can be engineered through policy, not begged for through aid. There is no guarantee of success here. Infrastructure costs are real, financing is tight, external pressure is constant. But something fundamental has already changed. The question is no longer whether Burkina Faso should keep more value at home, but why it ever accepted the opposite as normal. And when a question like that takes root, it rarely stays contained within one border. The deeper issue now is not whether cotton can carry this ambition, but how many other African countries are quietly measuring their own raw exports and wondering what would happen if they stopped letting their future leave unprocessed. The true climax of this story does not arrive with applause or a dramatic announcement, but with a change in tone that spreads quietly, and then all at once. It begins when cotton, long treated as a silent servant of foreign supply chains, starts to behave differently in the global conversation. Traders notice delays not caused by chaos, but by choice. Contracts read differently. Volumes are discussed alongside processing, not before it. For years, Africa had been spoken about in the language of shortage, instability, and need. Yet suddenly, Burkina Faso is speaking in the language of terms. This is where emotion enters the room. Because when a country that has been told to wait finally stops waiting, those who benefited from the waiting feel it immediately. In Ouagadougou, the shift feels restrained but heavy with meaning. Workers at processing facilities talk less about survival and more about continuity. Farmers speak cautiously, but with a pride that does not need permission. A mother selling food near a cotton root says something that captures the moment better than any official statement. If the work stays here, the children stay here. That sentence carries more weight than any spreadsheet. At the same time, beyond Burkina Faso's borders, reactions sharpen. In Western policy circles, the language remains polite, but the subtext tightens. Analysts warn of capacity risks, market inefficiencies, and governance challenges. These words sound neutral, but they mask a deeper discomfort. Because the system that kept African countries exporting raw value depended not on force, but on habit. And habits are hardest to defend when they are questioned calmly. Ibrahim Traore's role in this moment is not theatrical. He does not declare victory or frame the shift as a confrontation. Instead, he repeats a simple idea that lands like a stone in still water. African labor must serve African futures first. That line circulates, quoted and requoted, because it names something many felt but rarely heard spoken by someone in power. Across the Sahel and beyond, people listen closely, not because they believe Burkina Faso has solved everything, but because they recognize the courage of naming the imbalance out loud. The emotional peak intensifies as the implications become harder to ignore. If Burkina Faso can begin keeping value from cotton, what does that mean for cocoa in West Africa, coffee in East Africa, or minerals across the continent? Each commodity represents a quiet fear for those accustomed to setting the rules. Reaction turns into recalculation. Some foreign buyers test pressure. Others explore alternative suppliers. A few attempt to wait it out, assuming the experiment will exhaust itself. But inside Africa, the mood is different. Conversations shift from whether such a move is allowed to whether it is overdue. In markets and meeting rooms, people ask the same question in different ways. Why did we ever accept that the price of our work would be decided elsewhere? The emotional climax is not anger, it is awakening. It is the moment when dependence stops feeling safe and starts feeling dangerous. Even critics of Traore acknowledge the psychological shift. Once dignity becomes part of economic planning, it cannot be easily removed. This is where the reaction becomes global. American and European observers understand that this is not about Burkina Faso alone. The fear is not loss of cotton supply, it is loss of precedent. If one of the world's poorest countries can disrupt an old pattern without collapsing, the argument that dependency is necessary begins to weaken. And when arguments weaken, power adjusts. Yet the most powerful reactions are not written in reports. They appear in small, human moments. A young man in Dakar says he is watching Burkina Faso because it makes him question his own future. A trader in Accra notes that buyers now speak more carefully. A diaspora worker in Europe wonders aloud whether returning home might one day make economic sense. These are not coordinated movements. They are signals, and signals matter more than declarations. The climax reaches its quiet peak when it becomes clear that this story cannot be contained by silence or dismissed as temporary. Burkina Faso has not overthrown a system, but it has exposed a truth. Control over value is control over destiny. That realization moves faster than any shipment. It crosses borders without visas. It settles into minds that have long been told to be patient. From Washington's perspective, this is unsettling because it arrives without hostility. There are no chants, no threats, no burning flags, just a steady refusal to play a losing role. And refusals of that kind are difficult to punish without revealing insecurity. As pressure builds, the emotional weight of the moment deepens. Africa is not asking for permission. It is testing itself. And the world is forced to watch, not knowing whether to intervene, adapt, or pretend nothing has changed. This is the tension at the heart of the climax. Not a clash of armies, but a collision of assumptions. Not rebellion with noise, but rebellion with structure. The question now hangs unresolved, heavy and unavoidable. If dignity can be built through ordinary work like cotton, how long can the old order survive on the idea that Africa's role is to supply and wait? The consequences of Burkina Faso's cotton shift do not unfold in conference halls first. They surface in homes, markets, and quiet decisions made at dusk. When value begins to stay closer to where work is done, daily life absorbs the impact before any macroeconomic chart does. In cotton-growing regions, the rhythm changes. Harvest season no longer ends with a hurried sale and an anxious wait. It extends into processing schedules, storage plans, and local demand forecasts. That extension matters because it turns agriculture from a moment into a cycle. Families begin to plan months ahead instead of weeks. A shopkeeper near a processing site notices steadier foot traffic. A school principal speaks about attendance stabilizing after years of children leaving with migrating parents. These are small changes, but they accumulate into something political without ever raising a slogan. Stability, when it appears, becomes a form of persuasion. On the civil side, the most visible consequence is reduced pressure to leave. Migration has long been a safety valve for African economies under strain. When local value chains strengthen, that valve does not disappear, but it tightens. Young men and women start asking whether staying could be viable. Not whether it will be easy, but whether it is possible. That question alone marks a shift in national psychology. It changes how risk is perceived. It changes how loyalty to place is calculated. Politically, this places governments under a different kind of scrutiny. Once citizens see that policy choices can influence whether work stays local, patience for excuses shrinks. Ibrahim Traore's administration faces this pressure directly. The promise implied by retaining value is not abstract. It is measured in wages paid on time, facilities maintained, and corruption restrained. This is where the experiment becomes dangerous. Success raises expectations faster than failure ever could. Every improvement invites comparison. Why here and not there? Why cotton and not other crops? Governance becomes personal when people feel the effects at home. Internationally, these domestic shifts complicate the old narratives. Burkina Faso can no longer be described only as a recipient of aid or a site of instability. It becomes a country attempting to manage its own economic direction under real constraints. That forces external partners to adjust their tone. Conditionality begins to sound intrusive when alternatives exist. Aid, framed as guidance, feels less convincing when local production shows progress. Yet the pressure cuts both ways. External actors test limits through financing terms, regulatory hurdles, and market access signals. Internally, political cohesion is tested by the very dignity the policy creates. Groups excluded from the initial benefits ask for inclusion. Labor organizations demand clarity. Regional leaders negotiate for their share. This is not collapse. It is friction, the kind that appears when something starts to move. The civil impact also reaches security in subtle ways. Economic grounding reduces the appeal of extremist recruitment, but only if momentum is maintained. A stalled promise can inflame resentment faster than no promise at all. That reality sharpens the stakes for Traore's leadership. He is no longer judged by rhetoric, but by continuity. The political consequence is a narrowing of space for error. At the same time, the symbolism travels. Other African governments watch closely, not to imitate blindly, but to learn where resistance appears and where room opens. Cotton becomes a case study, taught quietly among policymakers. How far can you push value retention before markets push back? How do you sequence reforms without choking cash flow? These questions move from theory to practice through Burkina Faso's experience. For citizens, however, the calculus remains simpler. Does work stay? Do prices feel fairer? Does tomorrow look less fragile than yesterday? These are the measures that shape legitimacy. And legitimacy, once rooted in daily life, is harder to undermine from the outside. The civil and political consequences of this shift are therefore inseparable. They form a feedback loop where policy alters behavior, behavior reshapes expectations, and expectations redefine politics. This is the unseen weight of economic sovereignty. It does not announce itself with celebration. It settles slowly, demanding competence and resilience in equal measure. The unresolved question now is whether Burkina Faso can sustain this balance under pressure, and whether its neighbors, seeing both the gains and the strain, will judge the path worth taking themselves. From Washington, the story unfolding in Burkina Faso is rarely described in emotional terms, but emotion sits just beneath the surface. Official language remains careful, wrapped in phrases like market stability, institutional readiness, and long-term risk. Yet behind those words lies a deeper unease, one that has less to do with cotton shipments and more to do with precedent. The United States has built its global economic influence not only through power, but through predictability. Markets function when roles are fixed, when producers remain producers, and price setters remain price setters. What unsettles American observers is not that Burkina Faso wants to grow, but that it wants to decide how it grows. In a world already strained by trade wars, reshoring pressures, and agricultural volatility, any disruption to established supply chains feels threatening, especially when it originates from a country long assumed to have limited options. Europe views the shift through a similar lens, balancing rhetoric about partnership with concern over control. For decades, Africa was framed as a space to be managed, assisted, or stabilized. Burkina Faso's cotton strategy complicates that framing. It suggests a future where African nations negotiate not from desperation, but from partial leverage. That possibility forces a recalculation of influence across the Sahel. International financial institutions respond with caution, emphasizing governance benchmarks and fiscal discipline. But the timing of those warnings is not lost on African audiences. Advice that once sounded neutral now feels reactive. Beyond the West, other global actors watch with quiet interest. Emergency economies see opportunity in partnerships that bypass traditional gatekeepers. They understand the value of engaging early, before new norms harden. China, India, and regional Middle Eastern players read Burkina Faso's move not as rebellion, but as pragmatism. They recognize a country seeking to maximize return on its labor, something they themselves once fought to do. Inside Africa, the global reaction becomes a lesson in itself. Citizens and policymakers alike observe how quickly concern rises when value retention enters the conversation. It reinforces a long-held suspicion that the global system is comfortable with African growth only when it remains externally guided. This perception fuels a subtle but powerful shift in confidence. The question stops being whether Africa is allowed to set terms and becomes whether it can afford not to. For the United States, the dilemma deepens. Applying pressure risks confirming fears of control. Ignoring the trend risks losing influence as alternatives multiply. Neither option offers comfort. The cotton story thus becomes symbolic far beyond its scale. It exposes a fault line between an old order built on extraction and a new order experimenting with participation. The global response remains unresolved, suspended between adaptation and resistance. What is certain is that Burkina Faso has entered a different category of attention. It is no longer invisible, and in geopolitics, visibility achieved without noise is often the most destabilizing of all. The open question for Washington and its allies is whether they will meet this moment with partnership on equal terms or retreat into habits that history is steadily making obsolete. In the end, what is rising in Burkina Faso is not a fantasy of sudden wealth and not a challenge shouted at the world's great powers. It is something far more difficult to dismiss. It is a country deciding that the work of its people will no longer be treated as an afterthought. In a global system dominated by giants, Burkina Faso does not pretend to be larger than it is. It does not claim immunity from pressure, sanctions, or risk. Instead, it chooses a different form of strength, one built from patience, discipline, and the refusal to accept a permanent lower rank. That choice alone is enough to change how history records a nation. When powerful countries speak, the world listens because they command scale, money, and force. When a small country speaks through action, the world listens because it reveals possibility. Burkina Faso's cotton strategy is not about humiliating the United States or defying Europe. It is about showing that dignity can be engineered, not granted. That message carries weight precisely because it comes from a place long dismissed as weak. For decades, global power measured success by control over resources, markets, and narratives. Africa was often positioned as the source, never the author. Burkina Faso is quietly rewriting that script, not by rejecting trade, but by refusing to trade away its future at a discount. Not by burning bridges, but by insisting that bridges carry value in both directions. In contrast, the great powers now face a different mirror. Economic pressure, agricultural strain, and political polarization expose vulnerabilities that size alone cannot hide. When a small nation begins to stabilize through local value and regional trade, it raises an uncomfortable comparison. It suggests that resilience may no longer belong exclusively to the largest economies. It suggests that power, in this century, may be measured less by how much you extract and more by how well you sustain your people. This is where the pride of Burkina Faso becomes visible. Not pride as arrogance, but pride as self-respect. Farmers who once felt invisible now see their work discussed in national terms. Young people who once planned escape now debate contribution. A country once spoken about as a problem is now watched as a test. Ibrahim Traore stands within this moment, not as a savior, but as a symbol of resolve. He did not invent cotton. He did not invent hardship. What he represents is the courage to align policy with human value and accept the consequences. That alignment is rare, and it is why the story resonates beyond borders. For the viewer watching from afar, this story offers more than information. It offers a question of values. What does strength really look like when resources are limited? What does leadership mean when excuses are abundant? And what happens when ordinary work is treated as the foundation of sovereignty? Burkina Faso's rise does not guarantee success, but it guarantees meaning. It reminds the world that dignity is not an abstract concept. It is built through choices, defended through persistence, and proven through results that touch daily life. As the global order continues to shift, stories like this will define the future more than speeches ever could. The final measure will not be who spoke the loudest, but who built something that lasted. If this story matters to you, tell me one value you believe Burkina Faso is defending. And if you want clear, steady analysis on Africa's rise and global power shifts, subscribe and stay with us.